Well, Bloomberg has learned that President Donald Trump's special envoy, Steve Witkoff, will meet a Ukrainian delegation to the U.S. this week as Kyiv's allies discuss possible security guarantees for the war-ravaged nation. But overnight, Russia unleashed a wave of drone and missile strikes on Kyiv, killing 14 people. Joining me now is Orysia Lutsevych, Deputy Director of the Russia and Eurasia Program and head of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House. Good to have you with us. You know, there was a lot of optimism and hope, I guess, around the Alaska summit a couple of weeks ago, and then Zelenskyy's subsequent visit to the U.S. alongside European leaders, that we may see some form of a breakthrough or at least progress when it comes to a peace deal. And yet, as we talk about this, Russia attacks on Kyiv keep going. Overnight, another massive aerial assault. What hope is there really of a breakthrough at this point?
Well, Jumana, you mentioned some optimism or hope around the Alaska summit, but in Ukraine, this event was described as shameful and despicable because, in a way, it rolled the red carpet in front of Putin, somebody who is, as you see, nightly bombarding Ukrainian cities, terrorizing civilians without any sign of willingness to either agree to a ceasefire or negotiate in earnest. So in a way, Alaska emboldened Putin to continue his war, unprovoked aggression against Ukraine, while President Trump embarked on this pleasing mission, thinking that if he looks in Putin's eye and if he offers him economic deals, this will be enough for Putin to stop the war. But he forgets that Putin has achieved none of his political objectives, neither vis-a-vis Ukraine, nor vis-a-vis Eastern Europe and U.S. presence in Europe. And all he wants to use the war in Ukraine to split United States from Europe.
Let me ask you a question about land swaps, because that is one of the topics that came up in the run-up to the Alaska summit and also out of it as well. How realistic is it to expect President Zelenskiy, Ukraine, to cede territory in the Donbass in exchange for firmer security guarantees out of Europe and potentially the U.S. as well? Is that a realistic quid pro quo?
Well, I think this is rather an absurd idea for two reasons. One, you can do land swaps between the territories of Russia and Ukraine. But as we know, Ukraine right now does not control any Russian territory, and it cannot swap its own territory. Secondly, there is an ironclad principle that the borders should not be changed by force. And we do know that Ukraine and its European allies disagree with this principle. And finally, why should Ukraine withdraw from its legal territory to give passage to the Russian army that is torturing, killing, and raping civilians? This would be totally immoral on the side of President Zelensky and is not supported by Ukrainian people. Nearly 70% of Ukrainians are against this idea.
Okay, so do you think the U.S. should be applying more pressure on Russia? And if that is the case, what does that pressure look like?
Well, I think this has been hope from the first days of Trump administration, especially in Kyiv, that he would try to pursue peace through force. So far, we are seeing pursuing of peace, but no force imposed on Putin. So that could be a variety of actions. One, it's secondary sanctions on countries that are buying Russian oil, and we have seen some of it imposed on India through the tariffs. Second, it's supply to more advanced weapons and not limiting the range of missiles that U.S. provides to Ukraine and enabling it to strike military targets inside Russia. And the third one is to actually continue the pipeline of support to Ukraine together with Europe, so that Putin understands that he cannot win this war, that the West will not abandon Ukraine, and that Trump will not agree to the list of his capitulation demands that he seemed to be putting on the table in front of Trump, including these land swaps we've discussed.
Yeah. How likely is it that a trilateral summit between Trump, Putin, and Zelensky will actually take place? Do you see that happening?
Well, we do know from President Trump that he would only have a trilateral summit if there is a bilateral meeting that yields some result between President Zelensky and President Putin. At this stage, Russians are putting again on the table requests to Ukrainian side that they know Ukraine cannot accept. And this request is basically that Ukraine should have a limited sovereignty. It should agree, for example, to Russian demands for the right of ethnic speaking Russian minority or Russian Orthodox Church, or for the same matter, the size of Ukrainian army. And they keep bringing back demands from the Istanbul meeting. And this is problematic. So it's unlikely that this meeting between Ukraine and Russia will take place at the high level.
Can I just ask you about how you're thinking towards the European response to all of this and the real move to put together a coalition of the willing, become a bit more self-reliant on self-defense as opposed to leaning on the U.S.? Where do you see all of this leading?
Well, Joanna, we see that United States wants to refocus, recalibrate its military assets from Europe to Indo-Pacific to deter and possibly face China in a future war. That means that Europe has to build its own military capabilities to be able to deter Russia and to defend Ukraine. That's why that meeting in Washington last week was so significant, that Ukraine was standing shoulder to shoulder with Europeans, because Ukrainian military capabilities, especially in a new type of warfare, drones, electronic warfare, are very significant and could actually be an asset for Europe rather than a liability. So we see Europe in expanding industrial square production, artillery shells. The Rheinmetall just opened a large factory to produce more artillery missiles. Europe is rearming, but it will take time and it needs a phased out plan for US presence in Europe. And I think Putin knows it. That's why he's escalating right now in order to achieve his objective before Europe rearms.
Yeah. Orysia Lutsevych, Deputy Director of the Russia and Eurasia Program and head of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House, thank you so much. And as she was speaking, we were showing some live pictures from Kyiv on the back of yet another Russian aerial assault on the city, which has killed 14 people overnight. These are live images from the Ukrainian capital.